Today we are continuing our discussion on Unit 8, the Doctrine of Salvation. We'll be looking at historical consideration. It begins with a discussion of Augustine and Pelagius. Augustine, or Augustine, is one of the major theologians associated with the doctrine of election. He believed that the fall had so enslaved human will that a special gift of prevenient grace, along with cooperating grace and efficacious grace, and the final gift of perseverance to his chosen, must precede any movement toward conversion. And so his view is much more complicated than some initially may present it to be. He did often use the analogy as well of the potter and the clay, saying that we all come from the same lump of clay. Some vessels are vessels for honor, some vessels are vessels for dishonor. Now, Pelagius saw this entirely differently. He believed that human will was unaffected by the fall. In fact, he would go so far as to say that Adam merely was a bad example. Now, this doesn't go far enough. If you just look at the original fall in the garden and say Adam was a bad example, you have to ask yourself the question, why is it that every single human since that time has followed that bad example? Is there not one of us that would have turned and done what was right and not followed the bad example? There's something that happened that caused us to be innately sinful. Our hearts are not good at their core. They're wicked at their core. And we all follow in the sin that Adam did in the Garden of Eden, and we fall away from God. All have sinned and fallen short. So we disagree with Pelagius here, but we move on and we look at Martin Luther and justification. Now, when you get to the Middle Ages and you've gone through all of the Catholic doctrine, you've done that in your church history classes, I hope. If not, you will. You move forward, you get to the Reformation, you get to Martin Luther right about that time. He begins looking at his doctrine, which, the Council of Trent and everything. The process begins with baptism as an initial infusion of grace and then continued along with the sacraments. The Catholic theology had several types of grace. You had prevenient grace, cooperating grace, actual grace. And in fact, Gabriel Biel said God would give grace to those who did the best they could. Now, this was absolute torture to Luther, because to do the best you can to get grace ends up being a works-based salvation, and you end up wondering, what can I do to tip the scale in my favor? How much do I have to do? Just a little bit more in order to tip the scale in my favor. There's no peace in a doctrine like that. And so when Luther discovered justification and the fact that God would declare you in his courtroom to be justified, that brought him great peace. And so that's where the Reformation starts. We also have mentioned in here an Anabaptist theologian. And one of the things I want you to notice here is that holding to the trichotomist position influenced his doctrine of salvation. Now, we would disagree with his doctrine of salvation because personally I hold to a dichotomist position. And so he says here that the flesh can do nothing more than sin. And then he goes on to explain that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, is what Paul meant by that. The soul or the will is wounded, and that the spirit is free to choose or reject Christ. And so his trichotomist position is essential to his doctrine of salvation. It's how our theology intertwines with other aspects of doctrine. We have to be careful that we're holding to proper aspects in all areas so that it fits together as a consistent unit. At any rate, that's what Hubmaier believed. Now we move to Calvin, and one thing I want to make sure you notice is that even though Calvin is often thought of in Calvinism, and he's often thought of in terms of predestination and election, if you were to read his Institutes, you would notice that prayer receives more discussion than election in its single chapter, which is the longest single chapter in the Institutes. And so in this section, yes, we're going to talk about Calvinism some. We'll talk about Calvin's views. But I also want to make sure that you recognize it wasn't central to everything he said in his theology. So if you reject Calvinism, you still need to read Calvin. He's got some good things to say. It's also questionable whether Calvin was even a Calvinist. There's a dissertation out by Kevin Kennedy, who teaches here at Southwestern, on union with Christ and the extent of the atonement in Calvin. There's also a good discussion in the book entitled Whosoever Will. It's edited by David Allen and Steve Lemke. Dr. Allen writes a chapter in here where he does a good job with the atonement and discussing limited atonement, and he does a good job using history, and so he quotes only Calvinists in this, and he quotes John Calvin. He says on universal atonement, consider the following quote from John Calvin. It is of course certain that not all enjoy the fruits of Christ's death, but this happens because their unbelief hinders them. The question is not dealt with here because the apostle is not discussing how few or how many benefit from the death of Christ, but simply that he died for others. Here's another quote from Calvin. Paul makes grace common to all men, not because it is in fact extends to all, but because it is offered to all. Although Christ suffered for the sins of the world and is offered by the goodness of God without distinction to all men, yet not all receive him. There's also a good discussion in the book about Isaiah 53:6. All we like sheep have gone astray. And then it goes on and says, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Calvin discusses the two alls in that particular passage, making sure that it's clear that all have gone astray and the iniquity of all have been laid upon Christ. And so there's some question as to where Calvin even stood. Now, there's no question about Theodore Beza or the Synod of Dort, which we'll get to. But I just want you to understand your history and make sure that you're thoroughly well read on all of these subjects. You come to Jacob Arminius. Believe it or not, Jacob Arminius studied under Calvin's chosen successor, Theodore Beza, at the Geneva Academy, which Calvin opened in 1550. Arminius's basic position was that he affirmed God's election, but he said it was based on foreknowledge. Well, as you well know, if it's based on foreknowledge, it's based on what man does, and as it's being based on what man does, that really undermines what Beza would have thought of as election, especially. But it was after his death in 1609 that his supporters came together, and they developed the 5 Articles of the Remonstrance in 1610. Now that is what the Synod of Dort was responding to, is the Articles of the Remonstrance. So in 1619 at the Synod of Dort, you have the statement which has now become famous on the tulip. If you've never heard of Calvinism before, you will hear about it discussed in frame reference to a tulip. The tulip is an acronym where the T stands for total depravity, the U stands for unconditional election, the L stands for limited atonement, the I stands for irresistible grace, and the P stands for perseverance of the saints. And so you can do more study on that on your own, but just to give you a brief synopsis here of what has taken place in history. Westminster Confession, you could see it. I've got some information for you there. What I want to focus on, though, are the 2 branches in Baptist history. You have a branch of Smith and Helwist, who were influenced by the Arminians, and that develops into General Baptist. Now, the General Baptist ceased to exist, but you have movements like Sandy Creek, you have people like E.Y. Mullins, you have others who tend to hold to a more Arminian view in Southern Baptist life. You have other people who hold to a more Calvinistic view. You have Spurgeon, you have John Gill, you have James P. Boyce, first president at Southern Seminary, and you have others who are particular Baptists. They hold to a more particular view of the atonement and would be considered Calvinistic in their theology. But what I want you to focus on is the fact that we've always had 2 streams of thought in Southern Baptist life. We've always had one that's less Calvinistic, not necessarily Arminian, didn't believe you could lose your salvation, but less Calvinistic, and you've had one that's more Calvinistic. So what I don't want you to do is create a false dichotomy. You're either a Calvinist or you're not. I also don't want you to create a dichotomy that only Calvinists or deep theological thinkers. That's not true either. We've had a lot of guys who have studied theology and who have thought deeply about this who just don't hold to limited atonement, and so they don't believe that's what the Bible presents. All of these views are perfectly fine in Southern Baptist life. Imagine a doorway. If you imagine a doorway and you try to walk through that doorway, on one side of the doorpost would be losing your salvation. If you go there, you've gone too far. On the other side would be hyper-Calvinism, where you say we don't need to do missions. God's going to save those he wants to save. We don't need to share the gospel. If you do that, you've gone too far. Anything in between those 2 areas can walk through the door together. That's what Baptists have done. You've had a Calvinistic stream, you've had a non-Calvinistic stream, and we have managed to walk together. Varying from 2, 3, 4, 5 points, it's not a reason to divide. So that's what I want to make sure you focus on. One final individual, Karl Barth. Now, he took election to a different extreme. He said that focused it on Christ as both the electing God and the elect man, and he said even those outside the church are not rejected. They too are electing Christ, they just don't know it. Now, this is not a view I want you to hold. It's not a human decision to reject God. In fact, he will not take no for an answer. Well, that's Karl Barth for you. He was closer to the right than the people of his day, but he was not near far enough to where we would want him to be. And that's your historical consideration for the doctrine of salvation. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or post them on the discussion board.